Hello, this is John Onesti back with you to talk about the Zapruder film, which I discussed in a previous video. And I mentioned the unusual behavior and observations in and around the presidential limousine that day. And I talked about how Governor Connolly, who was seated in the jump seat in front of the president, after the fatal headshot, can be seen going into the back of the car for some reason, which he leaves out of his testimony and interviews. Now that, for some people, will try to brush that away, that it's insignificant, but there's much more, and that's why I'm doing this second video here to discuss and expound upon Connolly and LBJ, their relationship, and their strained conflict with the Kennedys. And let me start out by just saying that Connolly I'll remind you in the previous video, that Connolly was one of LBJ's top allies. They rose together in Texas politics, and Connolly managed Johnson's campaigns. In the early 60s, Johnson was surrounded by scandals, which would have most likely led to his downfall in politics and maybe worse. But at the very least, the Kennedys had decided that they would jettison Johnson off of the presidential ticket for the 1964 election. So Johnson and Connolly were very upset about that, and they were worried that these scandals, which there were two large ones and probably more, but one was involving Billy Sol Estes, and another one was Bobby Baker. Estes was one of Johnson's business partners and campaign contributors, and Bobby Baker was Johnson's man in the Senate, and both of them were being investigated, and it would have led to trouble for Johnson. So they wanted to get even with the president. And how did they do that? Well, there were some very suspicious activities occurring in Los Angeles. John Connolly had a son-in-law by the name of Robert Allen Hale, and Robert Allen Hale was seen by FBI officials leaving Judith Exner's apartment in LA on August 7th, 1962. Hale and his twin brother were seen by FBI officials leaving a burglary, Exner's apartment. 2 days prior to that, on August 5th, 1962, in LA, also, Marilyn Monroe was murdered. Now you might say, what does this have to do with anything? Well, the person that they observed was Connolly's son-in-law, or former son-in-law, because Connolly's daughter was killed suspiciously by a gunshot, which Hale was suspected of doing, but it was later ruled a suicide, but it was suspicious. He was found not guilty, or it was just released. I'm not sure if it went to court or not, but in any case, Hale was around some very suspicious activities, and he leaving Exner's apartment would be one of those. Now, those two women, Exner and Marilyn Monroe, are important because both of them are widely believed and portrayed as JFK's mistresses, which may or may not be true. But we do know that they were couriers of information to the president and the Attorney General and that information in the case of Exner would have had to do with CIA and organized crime because she had a relationship with Sam Giancana. And in the case of Marilyn Monroe, it would have had to do with the media, Hollywood, the CIA, Operation Mockingbird, and more. I'll add also that another mistress, or so-called mistress, was Mary Pinochet, who was Cord Meyer's wife. She was later found, she was murdered a year after the assassination. And her husband, Cord Meyer, was the head of the CIA's Operation Mockingbird. So there you have three so-called mistresses of JFK, which all had in common being information carriers, and two of the three were murdered, and the other one was very closely monitored, and we know that. But it's highly suspicious that Governor Connolly's son-in-law would have been found breaking into Exner's apartment. So that you have to wonder, you have to ask yourself then, knowing that, was Johnson and Connolly in 1962, and who knows how much before that, were they running a counterintelligence on the Kennedys, knowing that the Kennedys were investigating their scandals and that they were going to remove Johnson from the ticket? Is that what was going on there? Were they trying to frame Robert Kennedy for the death of Marilyn Monroe? You have to ask yourself that, knowing that Exner's apartment was broken into 2 days after. And you could check all that out, research it for yourself. Another item I'll mention is that the mainstream media loves to dirty up the president, Kennedy, the former President John Kennedy, by saying that he had these mistresses and he was unfaithful to his wife and so on and so forth. And that may or may not be true, but let's discuss facts here. Facts are, there has never been an illegitimate child of JFK like there has been shown one of LBJ, yet the media really loves to point out how JFK was this unfaithful, dishonest man when it came to sex. But they don't treat these two men equally. Why don't they talk about LBJ and his illegitimate son, which you can read more about in a book called Texas in the Morning by Madeline Duncan Brown. And also in that book, you will find, because she was Johnson's mistress, and she was at Murchison's mansion the night before JFK was killed. And guess who else was there? John Connally, Johnson, and many other people. And Johnson at that time told Madeline that after the next day, the Kennedys would never embarrass him again. And you can find that in her book, Texas in the Morning. Another point that I did not discuss in the previous video, which I would be remiss not to tell you now, is what happened to Connolly's clothes on that day, the clothes he wore at Daley Plaza that day. Did you know that Henry Gonzalez, longtime congressman from Texas, was ordered by LBJ to bring Connolly's clothes from Dallas to Washington, where they were cleaned, laundered, pressed? Why? If Connolly was hit and that was his blood on his clothing, why would it be necessary to bring those clothes to Washington and have them cleaned? Was he hit? That's what you have to ask. Also, who do you suppose it was that convinced JFK to go to Texas and to include Dallas on that trip? Who do you suppose it was that convinced him that that was a smart thing to do and that was necessary and that they needed to bring together the Democratic Party in Texas? Take a guess. It was John Connally. And he went to the White House in early October, the month before JFK was assassinated, to convince the president that he needed to come out to Texas and to include Dallas in that trip. Another item, Lee Harvey Oswald. It was claimed by Connally and the media and others that Oswald disliked Connally because Oswald was in the Marines, which is part of the Navy, and he was discharged, and he wanted to change the status of his discharge because it was a dishonorable discharge, and he wanted to have that changed. And he knew he wanted his record so that he could show that he was working for the Office of Naval Intelligence, but he also wanted his discharge changed to an honorable discharge. Connally claims that he was targeted by Oswald that day in Dallas because of that request of the discharge being changed, the fact that it was denied. But Connally did not deny it. It was Paul Fay who denied it, because Connally only was on as Secretary of the Navy for a very short period of time, and there was a conflict there, a controversy and a bad feelings between Connally, Red Fay, and JFK, which you could read about in Red Fay's book, Pleasure of His Company. Red Fay was a good friend of JFK's. But Fay was the one who denied Oswald's request to have his discharge paper changed. So if there was anybody that Oswald would have been upset with, it would have been Fay. It would not have been Connally. But they're trying to get you to believe that Connally was targeted along with JFK by Oswald, which is nonsense because it's not true. So you can research that if you like. Further problems for Connally. It has been pointed out by other researchers, including Jim Mars and others, that the bullet that is claimed to have hit Connally and the fragments that are alleged to have come out of Connally's wrist, there's a discrepancy. That there were more fragments claimed to have come out of Connally's wrist than there are missing on the bullet. So there's a problem there for the official version people. But not only that, I question whether that X-ray is truly Connally's wrist and whether that bullet is not what hit Connally. That bullet probably was never even fired in the plaza. If it was, it may have been fired somewhere else, but it was probably planted evidence. But all of that comes into question. The bullet, the X-rays, and the fragments, all of that. And why do I think that? For all the reasons that we just discussed earlier, but also Dr. Cyril Wecht wanted to exhume Connally's body for good reason, but he was denied. Wecht is the expert on this subject. And what would Wecht have found? He might have found a pristine wrist in Connally's tomb, which would mean that he was never hit, which would mean that even the grassy knoll and the Texas School Book Depository ideas are faulty, and that Connally was in on this plot. So what was it that the family didn't want us to know, didn't want Wecht to discover by exhuming Connally's body? have to ask yourself those questions. Now, I'm going to be doing more videos discussing what had happened even before and after Dealey Plaza, but also focusing again on the unusual behavior of those in and around the car. I'll be discussing the Secret Service and their role in this, including what was discussed in Gerald Blaine's book, and how there was a rehearsal, what I believe to be a rehearsal in his book, and I may even read that to you. And I'll discuss other members, people who were in the car and around the car and what they did. And I'll even talk about other things like the paint marks on Elm Street. You can get more insight into all of this and much, much more in my new book, Assassination Point Blank. I'm John Onesti. Hope you read my book and hope you watch my videos. Have a nice day.